welcome everybody. After much malign technology, we're here with you again. JD, Greg, and we got Rob Sherrill with us. Rob's a proud owner of Citywide Insurance. He's sponsoring our first segment, talking about the college playoff. Rob, you want to talk a little bit about what you do with Citywide? More than anything, I can tell people you save them money.
That's what we try to do. We offer, full service property and casualty coverage, home, auto, umbrella. We do a little bit of commercial insurance, but our primary focus is the home and auto side of things. And we represent a number of carriers. I'm an independent agent, so we represent Travelers, MetLife, Progressive, Safeco, and basically we've got contracts with 42 companies and some general agencies, so we can shop your coverages around and do all we can to save you money. And I think our service is second to none. So anybody that wants to give us a call and give us a chance to try to save them some money, it doesn't cost anything but a little bit of time. And I promise you we'll take care of you.
What's your phone number, Rob?
770-433-0318. And the website is citywide-insurance.net.
And you
what if I live in Hayhira?
Hayhira, we love Hayhira. We save folks money there all the time, from St. Simon's up to Ringgold. It doesn't matter. If you're in Georgia, we love you.
Well, and yeah, we'll get to sports, but I will say, checking your insurance is something you ought to do yearly, and just to see that your rates are competitive. And I think you'd be, if you give Rob a call, I would put my money on he'll save you some money. With that,
let me throw in there too. I've been a Citywide man with my auto, and I've got a good friend of mine. We won't mention his name, but Rob hooked him up. And he's got a big property out in West Georgia, all kinds of cars and everything. So you still owe me a good dinner for that one, and probably then some.
That is still the largest account at Citywide Insurance, and we saved that guy about $5,000 a year.
So JD, what do you think about Urban?
He's he and Saban are the top two guys, and when you look at Meyer, what's really remarkable in his last 10 years as a head coach, going back to 2004, and remember he took 2011 off. He's won 3 national titles. He's had 2 other seasons when he went undefeated: 2004 at Utah and Ohio State 2 years ago, and 2 seasons where he was a game away from playing for the national championship. 2013 with Ohio State, they lost the Big Ten title game. In 2009 with Florida when they lost Alabama in the SEC championship. I've said before, he's about as warm and cuddly as a rabid porcupine. But when it comes to production and what he's done, it's absolutely incredible. And when you look at Meyer and Saban, they're not only the 2 best coaches going now, the 2 best coaches of the 21st century, they've certainly both put themselves in a position where you could call them, and whether you're listening off a top 10, top 15, these guys have both ascended to greatest amongst the greatest college football coaches of all time. And for both of them to have won national titles at multiple schools, I'm telling you, too, it's a great thing for college football that Jim Harbaugh is at Michigan, because this thing was pretty much setting up with a playoff in place. As long as Meyer was at Ohio State, Michigan's where they were, Ohio State was looking like they were going to make the playoffs something like 6, 7, 8, 9 years in a row. So I think it's great that they're going to have some competition now with Harbaugh at Michigan.
Well, one question, for those of us that are, in that second tier and wanting to get to the next tier, which would be the Bulldog Nation, what do you think sets those guys apart, and what do you think this new coaching staff can do to get us to the next tier?
Well, they've got brains, they've got attention to detail, and they recruit great players at every position every year. And that certainly showed at quarterback this year. To do what they did in these 3 games with their third-string quarterback, it really is the stuff of legends. And you can't have an off year recruiting. And all you have to do is go back, and when you look at some of Georgia's struggles and some of the questions heading into this year, look at the class of 2013 and really what a disaster it's turned out to be. And you look at what Georgia's doing on the offensive line this year. It's just extremely disappointing. You have to produce every year in recruiting. And now obviously it's set up too for Meyer now at Ohio State, though the Big Ten's certainly coming up. They don't have near the competition that there is in the SEC. But these guys are relentless. They're maniacal. And it certainly shows up on the field. The other thing with those guys, when they lose, it's almost always in close games, and they do not beat themselves. And I've always said that the first step for Georgia making that next step, that final step, is to stop beating itself. And unfortunately, we can't seem to get out of our way. And even you look at this year, even if you leave the Florida disaster in there, if we pitch it to Gurley first and goal on the 4, if we don't squib kick, we're probably sitting at 11-1 heading to Atlanta.
Hey, Jeff, one thing I just wanted to mention about Ohio State and recruiting is that they are under the Big Ten regulations. Georgia fans have always complained that Alabama was running a sign and cut operation and over-signing, but that is definitely not the case with Meyer. He's done a fantastic job using the Big Ten's restrictions.
Yeah, he really has. And again, I mean, I think it's a spot now, and if Harbaugh gets Michigan going like we all think he can, there's a pretty good bet that whoever wins that Michigan-Ohio State game every year is going to be in the playoffs, and especially when it expands to 8 teams here within the next 2 or 3 years. So he really has done a remarkable job. The guy is an absolute all-timer. And again, for what he's done at Florida and Ohio State, and I remind you, too, don't forget that undefeated season at Utah. He was there 2 years, and before that he was at Bowling Green and had a couple of 9-3. So the guy really has had a meteoric rise, and there certainly doesn't seem to be any signs of them slowing down. And I would say next year when you're looking at the 4-team playoff, I think the rest of the country is fighting for 3 spots because you look at their schedule, funny things can happen. I don't see anybody beating them next year, though.
JD, I was at breakfast this morning. I'm down on St. Simon's, and somebody asked me, about the kid from Liberty, Raekwon from Liberty County. What happened? And maybe you can, the guy's question was pretty simple. How in the world does that guy end up at Ohio State?
They out-recruited Georgia. It's pretty simple. Georgia was late getting in there. Now they've got a kid, and I know I sent you a copy of the email. I've got a friend who's a school teacher down in the district. They've got a kid who's a sophomore this year named Richard LeCount, who was probably the #1 sophomore. He was first-team All-State. And my friend was telling me, she sent me an email. I forwarded it along to Coach Rick. She said, honestly, I think if Georgia gotten in early, Georgia could have gotten Raekwon. Richard's a huge Georgia fan, and at least the Bulldogs did make some contact with him. He was one of, I think, 3 or 4 freshmen in the state a year ago that they went after. But, it's kind of been the same old, and we have this debate a lot, and I understand you can't get them all. But at the same time, you go back to that class of 2013, Georgia got 2 of the top 15 in the state. You got to do better than that. I mean, to have 17 kids drafted out of the state in this past draft, Georgia signed 1 of them. That was Zach Mettenberger. I'm not saying you're going to have 12 or 13. That'd be great. But you got to get me at least 5. And I do think Georgia has been doing a better job. And, again, you look at this class, the defensive line looks great, but at the same time, the top 10 offensive linemen in the state, and, Greg, you follow it closely, too. This is probably as good a year for offensive linemen in the state. Georgia's got 1, and 8 of them are committed to other schools. So it's, it's just an area where Georgia has got to get better. I don't know what the answer is. And again, understanding you're not going to get them all, but the great Mike Cavanaugh always said, you got to get at least your fair share, and you've certainly got to do that on the line of scrimmage. And you look at Georgia's O-line classes. You have 2012, Georgia signed 2 high school offensive linemen, Theus and Pike. They also got Beard out of the JUCO ranks. That class of 13, Georgia got Kublano, Josh Cardiello, and Aldell Bynum. Last year, Georgia did sign 4, and 2 of them played. And this year, you got 1 high schooler and 1 JUCO, and Devondre Seymour committed. So, and what's really perplexing, too, I think that's the one position when you look at Coach Rick's tenure here, and for Georgia in the 21st century, more often than not, the offensive line is that position where year in and year out, it's like, boy, we've got questions with the talent, got questions with the depth. And all you had to do was look at that national title game for all the spread formation, the hurry-ups, and different schemes and designs. Football still won on the line of scrimmage. And you look at the Tech games and the Florida games, where did Georgia get beat? along the line of scrimmage.
Right.
Jeff, I think with the offensive line, one of the main problems is that Rick in the past has not been willing to allocate enough scholarships to the offensive line. He said more than once that dominant offensive line is not necessary for a championship team. And I don't necessarily agree with that. But if you're
Well,
going
we hadn't won a championship, so
yeah. Well, if you're only going to, I think they're only allocating 4 scholarships a year to the offensive line, and frankly, I just don't think it's enough. Because one thing that happens is like this year, you get 3 kids. He had 3 kids committed or almost committed with the kid, the African kid. I can't think of his name, Valentine or whatever.
Valentine. Okay,
Yeah.
good.
And the Allen kid out of Maryland,
Mm-hmm.
and then the kid from Marist. So he had Friend had those 3 kids committed or virtually committed, and then he was basically looking at one more slot. Well, when 2 of those 3 fell out by the wayside, or Allen may not be, we may get him back, but still you're still only have 4 slots, and in my opinion, they ought to be signing 5 a year.
I agree.
Because almost every offensive lineman is a project, and is probably not going to give you quality time until he's a redshirt sophomore. But anyway, it's just my gripe.
Yeah, and I think there's some stubbornness to that. And again, when you look at what a weak link it's been too often for Georgia, at the very least a question mark for Georgia. And, I get frustrated when I look at the number of DBs or receivers or those quote-unquote athletes that Georgia gets. And, what my DNA is. And I know even Georgia's first offensive line coach for Mark Richt, Neil Callaway, he told a good friend of mine, he goes, gosh, you need to sign 6 to 8 offensive linemen every year. And I'm with you. I think you got to get at least 5. But it's just a constant problem. And one good thing I do look at on the defensive side, I think we're all in agreement, Georgia was way too light up front. I didn't like a lot of the situations where you had a defensive tackle, defensive end, and 2 outside linebackers. It was too easy to get pushed around, and that showed against Tech and showed against Florida on South Carolina's last drive. But at the very least, you look at this defensive line class and you say, hey, at least they've recognized there's a problem on that front, and they're doing something about it, because it is a heck of a defensive line class, but this offensive line class is really troubling and disappointing.
Well, can I ask Jeff one thing?
Yeah.
Wouldn't you agree that the best offensive line Rick's ever had was Jim Donnins in 2002?
Yeah, that 2002 line, that's the best team that Georgia's had.
Yeah.
And then you think back to the 2007 team that finished second in the country. From the Alabama game on, the same 5 guys started there. And that 2012 offensive line turned out to be a cohesive unit. So, it's you talk about the line of scrimmage, that 2002 team was great. It was the best offensive line Georgia's had and the best defensive line that Georgia's had.
Right.
Jeff, we'll say this: the new guys that have come in have put out a bunch of offers. They've gone in and offered some of these kids that Georgia should have offered last year, and they're not going to get many of them. Hopefully, they'll get 1 or 2, but at least they've come in and been aggressive and put out offers in this class, and they're offering in the next class as well. So hopefully.
Yeah. And 2 things. Number one, I'm over it's this assistant, it's that assistant, it's this coordinator, it's that coordinator. It's still Georgia. It's the program, and everything starts at the top. And that's something we got to understand. Everything starts at the top. But you're right, Greg, for next year, just kind of peeking at it, and I know Georgia's got a commitment from Ben Cleveland already, but I know that there are 3 really high-end offensive linemen and 3 really high-end defensive tackles for next year. So I think next year could be one of the better crops of talent coming out, and it does look like Georgia's off to a better start there. And I don't think there's any question that's Jeremy Pruitt and his influence. I think, frankly, he came in and saw some of the things that the coaching staff was doing and some of the things with the administration. And, I liked it when he came out and said, hey, I was at Florida State, I was at Alabama. Here's what we used against Georgia. Here's what we got to do better.
Right. Now, JD, I think let's move in a little bit about wrapping up Georgia's this season and looking forward. But first, how about talking a little bit about what your new kind of venture you've been doing and all this. Tell people a little bit about kind of what you're doing. that fancy backdrop's part of your I guess that's your set. And what do people need to do if they want to join up to JD TV?
You go to jeffdansler.tv and subscribe and give us $36. It goes to a great cause, Jeff Dansler Sports. But yeah, I actually went and bought some fabric at the store and nailed it up there. It was my #1 home improvement project of all time. Yeah, mainly talk Georgia, and now with the calendar kind of flipping over, not having the weekly kind of set with football, I'm going to jump in and really get a lot of great Georgia figures and do some interviews. You guys like Vince Dooley and Mike Cavan and Jim Don and David Perno, Coach Diaz, Coach Bowerly, Coach Hack. Going to get a bunch of guys like that and line up some interviews. And I've had Coach Donnan on before. I've had the great George Bezekny on before. So really looking forward to that, and it's a lot of fun.
So you're having to like clean your house for the first time?
Well, just this part.
All right. Well, let's look at the season that was 2014 one last time. 10-4, obviously.
10-3.
Yeah, sorry, 10-3. So I was trying to give us another loss, but I mean, I think what hurts the most is when you look at Alabama. I think we could have been right there with them as far as competing for the SEC. And
well, I know what hurts the most is getting beat by Tech in just horrible fashion, and losing to South Carolina and losing to Florida. It was a disappointing season. It was very similar to 2008. People can say, oh, we finished in the top 10, but you know what? We lost 3 games, and we lost to Tech. And the bottom line is, for a second straight year, Florida and Tennessee both won 6 or fewer regular season games, and it was Missouri that cashed in and got to Atlanta, and Georgia didn't. And then this year that was compounded by the loss to Tech. And you can make all the excuses with injuries and attrition and this and that. Here's the bottom line. Las Vegas, which is the ultimate impartial observer, had Georgia favored in 2013 and 2014 in 25 out of 26 games. And Georgia lost 8 times.
Right. So, despite that, what are the positives moving into the new season?
Well, there were a lot of true freshmen that did awfully well for Georgia, and I do think Georgia's going to have some talent. The defense should be better, and this offensive line should be pretty good. I'm really worried about it for 2016, but the schedule is a lot tougher. Breaking in a new quarterback. And I've kind of thought 2016 would probably be the year where Georgia had a really good chance to make a run. But what I worry about in 2016 is the offensive line. I think unless Georgia gets excellent quarterback play, and maybe it'll be Jacob Park this year, and again, you're leaning on a redshirt freshman, I think with this schedule, you might be looking at another 7-5 type season. I mean, South Carolina with Spurrier's beating Georgia 4 out of 5 years. There's that 3-game stretch, home Alabama, at Tennessee, and home Missouri. What do you think there? Florida, toss-up. And then those last 3 games, Auburn on the road, Georgia Southern at home, and at Tech. I can promise you this. I was saying all year that Tech was gunning for us, and so are the boys from down in Statesboro. I can promise you that's not going to be an easy game. They beat Florida 2 years ago and almost beat Tech this year. So I just think this schedule this coming year is going to be extremely, extremely difficult. I think the biggest plus that we got in the offseason, though, was having Floyd, Jenkins,
right,
and Malcolm Mitchell all come back, and then Colton Houston get that 6th year. I think that was a huge boost. And then the other question is, 9 straight years, Georgia's lost a game by more than 2 touchdowns, 15 or more points. So when's that Saturday that Georgia's just not going to show up? Or is Georgia going to break history and do that? And, even though the special teams got much better this past season, in the 3 losses, there were still those disaster special teams plays. So what's Georgia going to do to alleviate that? Bottom line is, we lost 26 games the last 6 years. That's more than 4 a year. And in the last 7, Georgia's only had 1 year where it lost 2 or fewer games. That was in 2012. So hopefully a lot of that stuff is going to change. But there's no question when you look at the first out of the 14 years in the 21st century there, that the first 7 years, that 2006 where Georgia lost 4 times, that was the outlier. And unfortunately, the last 7 years where Georgia lost 2 or fewer games only once, that season has been the one that's been the outlier.
So Greg, you think you can sell 7 and 5 out there for next year?
I think I need to to keep down the pitchfork and you know,
The torches and the pitchfork.
torches and pitchfork crowd.
But now,
Yeah.
but serious, how Greg, how out there is, you know, and JD, you can chime in, or you know, the new hires, and you know, personally, you know, I think in our last podcast, right, or hangout before the bowl game, you know, I you know, kind of threw out there, you know, it was time for the athletic department to realize that the price of doing business has gone up substantially. So, you know, I think it's a positive that we're kind of in line with everyone else, but also look at somebody like John Elway, where he had a guy that made playoffs 4 straight years, but he didn't see that guy getting them to the promised land, and he moved on. So I mean, you know, it's a couple different trains of thought that you know, basically we've rewarded a lot of money for a not so great season.
I think you have to go with what they've done. You have to. I'm actually pretty excited, given all the changes. The new coaches, plus the apparent resolution of some of the spending problems in Butts-Mehre, you have to look at that as a positive. You don't know what's going to happen until next year, but these guys seem a lot more aggressive. It remains to be seen, like with online recruiting, whether there are actually any changes there or not. But the combination of Pruitt on the defense and sort of leading the program nowadays, and the new coaches on offense, and what seems to be a new attitude from Richt. And I mean, you have to look at that with you have to give it a shot. You know, I don't know what everybody feels about it, but I'm thinking it's not bad. It's certainly a good thing. It remains to be seen whether it's a killer move or not.
Well, here's the thing, and you just look at some of the things that Pruitt has said and how that's hurt Georgia in recruiting, and I absolutely think the marijuana policy has hurt. When guys look at it and say, hey, I get popped one time, I got to miss a game. I think Gurley being suspended for 4 games is something that Georgia's got to deal with, and I agree. I mean, Georgia needs to do the best that it can be. You don't want to get caught in between, and I kind of feel that's what happened with the last indoor thing, and that was under the previous regime's watch, but it's like, I always like what Spurrier said. We don't need an indoor place at Florida. The sun shines out all the time. But if you are going to build one, go ahead and do it right. Don't get caught in between. But all that being said, at the same time, Georgia still didn't give the ball to Gurley on 1st and goal at the 4. We did the same damn thing against South Carolina in 2007 when Noshawn ran the team down the field twice, and then he wasn't even in the game, and Georgia had to kick field goals, and that wound up keeping Georgia out of the SEC and probably national championship game. It's those attention to details, and then Georgia goes out there and squib kicks it against Tech, and it cost Georgia a 6th straight win over the Yellow Jackets. So I agree with the indoor practice facility and all that stuff, but still, in the end, those are just – and now the margin for error may not be there, and that's everything in sports. And that's, again, where that attention to detail, it just hasn't been good enough, because the bottom line is Georgia's just losing too many games. Again, 26 losses the last 6 years.
Yeah, well, Jeff, I was thinking
a new coach right now. Let's say if Coach Rick retired and Georgia hired somebody new, and you asked the Georgia fan base, would you be accepting if the next guy lost 26 games over the next 6 years? What do you think the answer would be?
Well, of course it would be no.
So now, JD,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, I think with the Schottenheimer, I mean, have you been able, or Greg, have you been able to kind of, I guess what I'm hoping the most is, Greg, I mean, touching on JD, what you're talking about when we've had key players on the sidelines in key moments, do we think, you know, and that really didn't change between Rick being the OC and Bobo being the OC.
All that starts at the top, though. I mean, isn't everybody over this assistant or that coordinator or that assistant or that coordinator?
Sure.
I mean, everything starts at the top, and whether it's right or wrong, I mean, when Alabama has some struggles with something, I guess some coordinators do get thrown under the bus, but Saban's there to take the brunt of the heat. I think that's one mistake that Coach Richt has made, kind of big picture, and I've said this many a time, that when things are bad, and he tends to say, well, it's not as bad as you think. Whereas a majority of Georgia fans, including the four of us, we're all up over 40 now, grew up in the Vince Dooley era. And that's probably why we're all very, with Dooley and Munson, you're just a natural born pessimist. But when the special teams played like crap, Coach Dooley came out and said the special teams was not good today, and it's not going to happen again. I'll promise you that. He wasn't arguing with the fan base. Whereas I look at 2013 when the special teams was an unadulterated disaster, and Coach Richt came out and said, listen, there are two different ways to handle it. I'm not saying one way is right or the other. And he said, well, it wasn't all bad. Well, it was. There were 13 STDs, special teams disasters, and Georgia ranked in the hundreds in both kickoff and punt returns. So whether his way is right or Coach Dooley's way was right, the bottom line is a vast majority of fans came up around the Dooley era, and they weren't used to having the head coach basically disagree with them over something that seemed so obvious. So if I could sit down with Coach and suggest that one thing to him, it would be just to call it like it is. And I can tell you for me, too, having David Perno as our baseball coach for 12 years and Andy Landers been doing games for 21 years, when the team plays like you-know-what, both of those guys call it like that. And I to me, that's a healthier way to do things, and I think that has caused some tension, maybe almost too much honesty, too. Like when he said we recruited Cam Newton as a tight end. That's the old Louis Grizzard, you say, I don't believe I'd have told that. And that might be one of those, too. But I think it's a big thing. If Georgia's not recruiting well on the offensive line, if the line's not playing well, call it out like that. You're not throwing kids under the bus. What you are is being honest. And the fans who've been there living and dying with it absolutely deserve that. Because, you can break down the X's and O's all you want, but fans can still see when the effort's there and can still see when things are painfully, obviously not good enough.
Hey, Rob, you want to chime in with anything? You got any positive spin here?
I'm not sure you can have a lot of positive spin. I sort of take the JD approach, and I would say we were 10-4 because losing to Tech should count twice. I mean,
damn right.
That's the worst possible thing that can happen to you. The way it happened this year. I was up there with.
Rob, you got your laptop in your lap and going back and forth. I'm getting seasick.
Okay, sorry about that.
It's okay.
I'll quit that. But it was it was a disappointment. I guess when you look at the beginning of the season, your three biggest rivals would be Tech 1, in my opinion, Florida 2nd, and South Carolina 3rd. We're 0-3 against them, so
right.
It's a disaster.
All right, Greg, I'm going to move to you. It's a new year, so we're putting our best foot forward. How does that start?
I kind of going back to what Jeff said, and I agree with Jeff. And we have these sentiments all the time, Jeff, on our recruiting thread, which is more of a general thread, these kinds of comments all the time. And the thing that I try to do is to point out that Rick is here. He's not going anywhere, at least not anytime soon. Certainly not this year. But so my hope and what I think I see going on is that Rick brought in Pruitt and gave him a lot of latitude on the defense, and I'd like to think that that's what's happening with offense, so that these coordinators now, if they are both aggressive and get what they want, then hopefully some of these things that Jeff was talking about can be remedied. For example, with the runs that Jeff was talking, with not running, Gurley, that Jeff was talking about. Well, Mike Bobo was Mark Richt's doppelganger and his double in the booth calling plays. I mean, he come up with him. Perhaps the new offensive coordinator is going to go in a different direction when those things come up. And Uh, so I don't know, but I find it encouraging that he made the change, that he didn't just hire someone who perhaps will come in and just be a lapdog for whatever Coach Rick wants to do. He certainly hired somebody on defense who's not that way. So
Yeah, but I think another thing too that is frustrating, and whether it's recruiting on the offensive line or the no-shot situation, the Gurley thing, I wish we would pay closer attention to history and not make the same mistakes, because that's something too that I think any fan base gets. And this goes anywhere. I'm not just talking about Georgia. I remember Spurrier saying after his last year, after a while, people just get tired of you. And I'm not saying that's the case necessarily at every school, but people do get tired of losing the same way time after time. And we've just seen it too often. And again, to me, the South Carolina game this year, although that was high scoring in the game in '07, wasn't. It was just a carbon copy. It was a missed opportunity with Georgia not giving the ball to its best guy who had put them in that position. And, you know, how many times in Florida have bad kicks down there, bad kicking? How many championships does that cost Georgia? Well, we got to 2nd down and 4, and Chubb doesn't touch the ball, and we don't go for it on 4th and short. We rush to get off a kick in the wind and miss it, and then we get caught with our pants down again on the fake field goal. And then in the Tech game, you know, for the last month, we hadn't been able to field those lob wedge kickoffs. So it's the same things happening time and time again. That's where so much of the frustration comes from. And, you know, I almost get the sense, too, with Coach Rick that, you know, the more that people have yelled for, say, getting a special teams coach, the less likely that he is to do it. Now, the special teams did come a long way this year. It was vastly improved. There's no question. But at the same time, in the 3 losses, there were just disaster plays. And then there is stuff that could only happen to Georgia. Like in the South Carolina game, Marshall Morgan sets a record for consecutive field goals made and then misses his next 2 kicks. I mean, that's the type of stuff that could only happen to Georgia.
So let's move on quickly to some basketball. First thing I do want to encourage, I don't know how many of y'all are runners out there, but one of our sponsors, Southeast Georgia Health System, they've got the Bridge Run coming up February 14th. They call it the most grueling 5K. You actually run over the Sidney Lanier Bridge and back. So
hey, that's Valentine's Day. There might be some jumpers out there that day. You got to be careful.
But yeah, I guess U.S. Track and Field calls it the toughest 5K in Georgia. So if you're a runner, y'all should come down here and support a good event. And I don't think I'm gonna be ready for this year.
Party at the Levy's house afterward.
That's right.
Hey, can I ask JD one thing?
Yes.
Going back to things that only happen to Georgia, the Tech game, and this is strictly off the top of my head, you would know this, but I just started thinking about it. I think going into that game that Mason had probably 200 or something passes in a row without an interception.
Yeah. I know.
He
I know.
throws the interception to lose the game basically after Tech flubs the extra point. I mean, that's just like the Marshall Morgan thing. I mean, it
ran a great fake field goal to set up a field goal.
Yeah, amazing.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, and don't forget that pass attempt was going to net about 2 yards.
That's a risk versus reward deal there.
Yeah, but hey, Rob, talk a little bit about men's hoops. This is not exactly the segue into positive news after the last 2 losses.
No, I was wondering about the Bridge Run, to be honest, after the last Saturday night. I mean, that was, and I've got to defer once again to JD on something, because me and him talked about a game, I believe it was in '95 when K2 and then went up to Carolina, and you said it's in their program as one of the greatest comebacks in Carolina history, a game against Georgia. Isn't that correct?
It was the game. I don't know the one you're talking about, but it's the one when they came back here a couple days after Christmas in '97, I think it was, and we were up by 8 points with like 1:10 and lost it.
Yeah, well, we're a footnote in somebody else's program.
Right.
We were up 8 with 1:16 to go at LSU Saturday night, and
that's hard to lose like that.
Yeah, no, it's not only hard to lose like that for a fan, it's hard to watch a loss like that. I mean, it was brutal, and I was uneasy watching the game. The bad thing is in our hoops report this week, we talked about it because, I mean, Georgia had, you know, they probably deserved to beat Arkansas, but Arkansas was a good team and came back, but they flat out gave the game away Saturday night to start the SEC season 0-2. And we highlighted the fact that through Georgia's first 4 SEC games, they needed to be 2-2. They're 2-2 after those first 2. They got a good chance to make the tournament, in my opinion. So now all you got to do is go beat a team at home in Vandy that you hadn't beat since 2006, I believe, in Vandy. And then you got to beat the other team, the next game, Florida, who's been to 3 straight Elite Eight. So you really set yourself up for failure here, I think, with these first 2 losses. But, hey, who knows? You know, it's just.
And we had a guy get hit by a car.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Rob, you guys are killing me. All right, Rob. So one of the biggest problems, and you and I have talked about, you highlighted in every one of your well-written articles, is turnovers and missed layups. But let's saying you could curb those, which is going to be a must if this team's got any hope of making. What are their strengths, and how do they how could they guide them into the tournament if they do, in fact, reduce the number of turnovers, make some free throws, and the easy layups start knocking them down?
Well, I don't want to be all negative because I love Georgia hoops and I like the guys we got on this year's team. I mean, I've said it a million times. We've got a lot of experience and a little bit of talent. And, our talent is actually probably better than I'm giving them credit for, but it gets frustrating with the turnovers as well as the missed free throws. But our positives are, you've got Charles Mann, who's obviously a good point guard. He gets to the line more than anybody in the SEC, but he shoots 60%. So, that hurts you. Kenny Gaines, in my opinion, is one of the best scorers in the SEC, and I can't say enough about what J.J. Frazier's done, nor Marcus Thornton. But Jurisic has got to be a little bit more consistent, and I don't want to harp on one guy, but what's really hurt us a lot this year is we're getting absolutely nothing from Juwan Parker. He had 2 points at LSU the other night, and Cameron Forte was sicking out a little bit, and I think you may just have to go with the big lineup and start putting Forte in the place of Parker a little bit and seeing what happens, or just run the 3 guards with Frazier in there more so, because Parker's he's not taking the next step up. But the team, once again, we've got some talented players. The issue is the schedule really set up bad for us this year in the SEC with these first 4 games. They're all 4 very losable games, and we've got to figure out a way to right the ship. We can reduce the turnovers and hit the free throws. We're in good shape. I mean, J.J. Frazier shoots about 90% from the line. Gaines is about 85%. I mean, those guys can get the line and score, but the problem is Charles Manns, who's getting to the line all the time, and he's shooting, once again, 60% from the stripe as your leading free throw shooter. And that hurts, when that's the guy shooting.
Yeah, you're giving away a lot of points. They'll kind of sum it up like this. The women have got a really good team. They're 15-2 and 3-1, but they don't have much margin for error. They have a hard time scoring, and the great Hugh Durham summed it up best. Said, "I got plenty of shooters. I need some makers."
All
right.
Well, and the bad thing, and JD, I'm sure he'll tell you this, is it doesn't show up in the box score, but we miss so many front ends of 1-and-1s, and I mean you're giving away twice as many points there.
Hey JD, I got a women's hoops question. Where is South Carolina's have they been steadily improving? Or
they got in, first of all, they got a great athletic director, Ray Tanner, who's their iconic baseball coach.
And just so everyone knows, they're #1 in the country. Excuse me for interrupting.
Yeah, no, they got Dawn Staley as their head coach, and she was a great player. She was an Olympian, very popular, very tenacious. So she's come in there and just done a phenomenal job recruiting. But, I mean, they were bottom of the barrel most years in the SEC. So it's been a meteoric rise, and they are very, very good. And I'll tell you what, Ohio State came pretty heavy after, and Ray Tanner played it perfectly. and kept Dawn Staley there. Yeah, they're awfully good.
So just so that we know, JD, when do the Lady Dogs play both South Carolina and Tennessee, and then who else is good? Is Kentucky good this year?
Yeah, in fact, we've got a stretch. The women are at Ole Miss Thursday and play Vandy at home Sunday. Those will be tough games, but need to win those. And we got a stretch. We go at Tennessee, at Kentucky, Texas A&M, and South Carolina back to back. So all those teams are in the top 10. That's going to be
So South
tough.
Carolina's home or away?
South Carolina's here in Athens.
What's that date?
That is, I think it's the Sunday after the Super Bowl. Listen, I have to go week by week, man.
Sure. Well, no, I just think, if you're a purist in basketball, the women's game is definitely for something you would enjoy.
High-end women's games, high-quality basketball. It really is, and it's more about the skill than I think that's one of the things that's hurt men's basketballs. Back in the 80s when it was the best, it was an ultimate combination of skill and athleticism. It's become much more athletic and power than skill.
Plus, with the women, the great thing is you can take your headpiece there and listen to JD call the game.
Now we're
It's
talking.
always a big timer right there. I mean, I miss listening to the men, I'll tell you that.
Well, thanks, Rob.
His basketball is awesome. Hey, Greg, you want to wrap things up with some recruiting? Give me something positive, Greg. I mean, it's rare when I'm the most positive one.
Can't lose to Tech.
There you go.
Can't lose to Tech. I mean, and you know what? You shouldn't be positive after you lose to Tech. And if the Georgia people aren't pissed off after stuff like that, then we got a problem. I'll tell you what, anger's a lot better than apathy.
I agree.
I'll tell you this, too.
That's when you got problems.
My son, and we didn't have a Christmas tree this year.
Thank
just
you very
because of that.
Hey, Greg, there's the name of this Google Hangout. Anger is better than.
There you go. Yeah, I like that. I think I will put that. I'm going to put that on the post when I put it on the on the site.
That way they'll know what they're getting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to put a positive spin on it, the recruiting class is going to turn out to be. Forget about the offensive line, Jeff. It's going to turn out to be a pretty good class. As Jeff mentioned earlier, there's some really good highlights to this class, and it's not impossible for them to fill out the offensive line slots with. They're not going to, if they can get Pat Allen back in and get a couple of projects in behind them, then they're going to have a typical Georgia offensive line class. Hopefully next year they can have a different approach to the offensive line and sign 5 or 6 because they're going to need 5 or 6 next year, and go from there. But there's the recruiting class is going to probably be in the top 5, maybe top 3. So it could be worse.
But with that offensive line deal, I mean, and here's what's worse too: not having to go after a tailback really because of Chubb and Michelle. It wasn't realistic to get a top-notch guy, and then with Eason coming in the next year, they really didn't pursue a quarterback. That freed Georgia up to zero in on those other positions, and that's what makes this offensive line class so disappointing. I think the defensive line and wide receivers A+, got a really good tight end. B+ to A- at linebacker in the secondary, and if Georgia
backs will be good too.
Yeah, and where's that? I'm sorry.
I said the defensive backs will be good too.
Sure. Yeah. So secondary and linebacker, and if Georgia can get Roquan Smith, that goes up even more. But I mean, that I just look at this as like a swimsuit model, but she's wearing an eye patch. I mean, it's that offensive line class. Just it's hard to get past that.
Yeah, and they're going to have to go strong next year after the offensive line and sign at least 6, in my opinion, in order to get this back on track. And frankly, they should. I've said this several times, but in my opinion, I think they should be signing 5 a year.
For sure.
Yeah, and again, until proven differently, I think you have to. If you're going to remain a fan, you have to give these guys that Rick hired the opportunity to see if there's been a real change in philosophy. We certainly know it's happened on defense. Perhaps it happens on offense as well. I think there are going to be excellent recruiters, so we'll just see what happens.
Yeah, but and I'll lean on what Danzler says about recruiting. The state of Georgia is a the four of us could get in our cars and go represent the University of Georgia pretty well. I mean, and I'm not at all discounting that, but I mean, you're a pretty good recruiter the minute you're recruiting for the University of Georgia and the state of Georgia.
Yeah,
When you're
and
the state
that's why
of
we'll
Georgia,
never fall as far as Tennessee did. Is even LSU back in the 1990s, or before Saban got there, they had a losing record 8 out of 11 years. You can half-ass your way to a decent class and 5, 6 wins. If you really go out and have a great class year after year in this state, there's no reason Georgia can't be as good as any team in the country.
but Greg, I am with you, Greg. Let's give these guys the benefit of the doubt, and hey, from an offensive philosophy, I'm banking on that Schottenheimer is going to put the big time players, the pro style that we're proud of is going to be built around the stars being on the field when it matters most, and not this, big time plays and your best player happens to be, it's not his time to be with the rotation. He just happens to be out. I'm confident that Schottenheimer's maybe going to come in and go, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. So that's what I'm most hopeful about, the change at coordinator. And nothing against Mike Bobo did great for us, and I'm happy for him, but that didn't change much between he and Rick, and I've got my fingers crossed that that's going to happen this year.
Yeah, hey guys, I got to scoot real quick. I'm going to leave you with this too. You got to have a quarterback who can move. All 4 teams in the playoffs had a quarterback who can scoot. You're putting yourself at a disadvantage if your QB can't run. I think Park's going to wind up winning the job.
All right, we appreciate it. Y'all go sign up for JeffDanzlerTV.com. There are some moments where he's cheery. Today's just not one of them.
Hey, if you call Rob, he's cheery all the time.
I know. I mean, Danzer's on his way to Oxford, Mississippi. He should be smiling.
All right, guys, I appreciate it. We'll do it again soon.
That was our
Talk to y'all later. Thanks.
Bye.